Hey everybody, my name is Darren Calhoun. My pronouns are he, him, and I serve on the board of Q Christian Fellowship. And I'm one of several people who works on our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts here at Q Christian Fellowship. This gathering is an important part of how we make sure that the values of equity, diversity, and inclusion are integrated into our everyday conversations. We hold these monthly gatherings on the first Sunday of each month where we discuss various topics related to EDI. Sometimes members of our community present or share, while other times we have guests from outside our community. Our goal is to grow and increase belonging in every single way. At the board level, we work to ensure that diversity and inclusion are reflected in our speakers, in our events, our locations, and our policy. And tonight we have a wonderful, wonderful guest who I've been so excited for us to bring to share with you. They're going to help us explore the um, spiritual, social, all the different components to gender and the sexual let me get this right. Gender and sexual pluralism outside of the contemporary West. Because that's a fun mouthful. I'm going to let them introduce that topic. But for now, what I want you to know is that Kai is somebody that I have looked forward to hearing from for quite some time. They have been working to do all kinds of really powerful work, research, education, workshopping. Really, they just bring so much to the table and have already been a part of putting out some really great things in the world, particularly at the intersection of faith and LGBTQ inclusion in churches. And so I will not keep us any longer, but I will turn it over. And Kai, take it away.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Carrie, for inviting me to come give this little talk. And thank you, everyone, for taking time to watch it live. I know these things get recorded later on, so there's technically no need to be here. So I honor your choice to come here and be present together with all of us. I have a little presentation, some slides, which at some point, Darren or Carrie will help me um, present because I'm on the iPad because I'm on the desktop and I can't figure out how to get the password to download Zoom. I'm currently in Malaysia. So a little bit about me, about why I'm here. I am a PhD student, so I do research in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia and Borneo, which is why I'm here for a few months of the year. But when I started giving these talks, I wasn't always uh, a student. Actually, I was just like a rando, mostly someone who like read books and tried to think about how they could be relevant for people outside of the academy. So I think the first time I gave this talk was probably, second time was probably at QCF back in like 20, before the pandemic. So maybe 2020, 2019, around there, during one of the breakout sessions and workshops. So it's been good to kind of go back to the material and think about, some of the stuff I was saying when I was more of a journalist and writer, how do I think about it now? Um, I want to kind of give you some sense of what my goals are with presenting the information I'm about to try to lay out for us and just give you a sense of what I'll be talking about. I'll be doing a series of very quick kind of snapshots, hopping around the globe, and Asia broadly, Africa broadly, the Americas, and I also will include a little bit of Europe, because I wanted to show if we look outside of the 20th, 21st century moment of LGBTQ, um, of the LGBTQ movement, which I say the West, but in some ways the West is global. Um, People use the word LGBT to describe themselves outside of America and Europe, for instance, whether through borrowing loan words from English or what have you, or their own like direct translations. But if we step back and look at examples sort of beyond this particular moment, what can we learn from them? Is my basic question. So I'll look back in time, so within Europe, but in the medieval ages, and I'll also look in the early modern period across the world and even into some contemporary movements, but outside of sort of the modern West. Um, But if we could go to the slide where I talk about my goals, that would be super helpful. The major goals I think I have is by help us rethink what is traditional, by looking at different kinds of traditions, partly because the sort of more conservative right-wing movement here has sort of used the term traditional, and we talk about still like traditional vows, traditional view of marriage. And so I want us to kind of question that a little bit. Rethink also what is gender, queer, or trans. If we, I sort of take, as hopefully you'll see through these talks that what even male or female is, the meaning of that differs a fair amount depending on the context and culture and society. And so then that has really broad implications then for then what queer is and what being trans is. It's like mini anthro 101. I should say that I'm in the anthropology and history program at University of Michigan. And if any of my academic advisors or peers listen to this, partly it's a bit horrifying for academics to do this talk because we're supposed to build a very niche expertise in one thing. But that is the blind spot of the academy. So I'm trying to go a little bit more broad beyond that. But more broadly, I think my last goal for us is to think about, I couldn't figure out a better way to phrase this, but different options for being in a way that I hope this conversation will be useful for people who aren't even queer or trans, just to think about ways in which, in particular, religion and faith and spirituality and what I call essentially a more porous way of being can come together. And hopefully that word will make sense in a bit. I have some non-goals in the second slide, which are basically, although these might be incidental goals or byproduct goals, I'm trying to avoid sort of overly, well, let's get to the first goal. I use this term transcestors. I think sometimes people, if you're not familiar with the term, it's in a sense a way of finding trans ancestors. And that particular term, I think I associate it with a way to find a lineage that you come from, an origin, ancestor who you can resonate with, so you don't feel alone and cut off in the world. And I think if that happens, that's really great. But I think it's helpful to separate that project in some ways from the information or the histories, in part for a number of reasons. Maybe most salient of it is ultimately one cannot really fully derive your validation and legitimacy from history. It's just always going to be a little bit lacking. And so it's helpful just to recognize where this desire is coming from and where the information is also coming from. And sometimes it's going to be a little bit like this. The second goal is not to overly blame white people. I think that can be a takeaway from this presentation. I think that makes a lot of sense. But if you look at the global church as it stands, where at this point most of the ardent, defenders of marriage between a man and woman, for instance, or a certain biological view of gender, is coming mostly from people in the quote unquote global South. And so sometimes I feel like the arguments that, oh, you only think this because of colonialism or because of, what have you, things in the past, actually in some ways undermines and disrespects the agency of people to take up homophobic and transphobic arguments. Sometimes they take them up in a post-colonial fashion, saying this is the way we're rebelling against Western values. This is the way we're asserting our independence. So I just want to be careful about how we think about agency in that sense. And secondly, I think although I am interested in like alternative modes of being differences, I'm aware that in this bias I have, there can be an overemphasis of the otherness of the non-West and create this sort of West versus East dynamic, or West versus the rest. And I know I can get into that a bit later, but it's all to say that, as I mentioned, the sort of the contemporary moment, particularly the contemporary queer movement, is a global phenomenon. And so depending where you are, I can be in the capital of Malaysia and have very similar conversations to what I have in New York City, and vice versa. So a bit of the outline. I'll go through, briefly touch on Middle Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour. I will pause. We'll have time for reflections and questions, and then I'll try to think about, help us walk us through some potential implications and inspirations, and then we'll pause slash stop really, and then have dialogue. Um, and I think, as mentioned, my section will be recorded. Your conversation will not be recorded. And so I think we're having people put stuff in the chat, if I recall correctly. But obviously, if you want to just talk, we'll stop recording so that way you can just also just go off mic. In fact, I would sort of prefer that. But to each their own. Okay. So there are a couple books that really came out in recent trans medieval history. The most recent one, well, second most recent one is Trans and Gender Queer Subjects in Medieval Hagiography, which you can ask ChatGPT to summarize for you. If you can't, it is an academic book, and there are book reviews of it. I also recommend that as an option. It is an academic book. But I just want to give a quick overview of some of this stuff. The main themes in this book, and I love medieval stuff for this reason, is the prominence of essentially transmasculine monks. Monks who, are discovered to not have certain genitals one would expect at their deathbeds. And what's interesting is the reception to them. There is a little bit of like, oh, well, that wasn't like the best, but then they become saints, because it's understood they did that for a holy purpose. They wanted to be monks, they wanted to be brothers, and it's unclear if they were fleeing persecution from home and the monastery was a safe haven for them. But there's a very famous one named Saint Marinos. There are a few others. And so this book and other books, you just Google trans masculine monks, you'll get a bunch of stuff. What's interesting to me in the European tradition, that it tends to be more transmasculine, and the rest of the world tends to be more transfeminine. We can kind of think about together why that might be the case. Obviously, no one really knows, but that's the fun part of doing this. The next book that came out recently is The Shape of Sex by Leah Devine, Non-Binary Gender from Genesis to the Renaissance. Transmission Ministry Collective recently did a workshop with her. Or that one, unclear about the pronouns. And I don't know if that's online, but you can also do something, read book reviews, stuff like that. Great images in this book. And it came out, like I said, just in the past few years. So this is really like a inflection point for trans scholarship in European context, pre-modern context. But one of the basic theological arguments that she's making, that they are trying to make, is that Jesus is often, they argue, depicted in hermaphroditic, as a hermaphrodite, and I use that term to indicate the term that people were using back then. So sometimes different genitalia and stuff have you, and a lot of it has to do with the vision of Adam. When Adam is created in the book of Genesis, though we think of Adam as the male and Eve as the woman, in sort of Hebrew, Adam just means, I believe, someone who went to seminary. Technically, I did too, but I didn't take any Bible classes. It just means earth, right? And so at some point, I believe it is in Genesis, I forget, 1 or 2. Gender really only appears after Eve is created, when the rib is removed, stuff like that, which means that Adam, before the Christian Eve, some scholars and medieval hagiographers, stuff like that, saw Adam as both genders, a sort of non-binary gender, so to speak, that then gets differentiated after Eve is created. So thus you see that painting on the right, where Eve is coming out of Adam's side. And so you'll have paintings of either literally a two-headed figure, like in this case, or a sort of mixed figure. And so Devine makes this argument that the ways in which Adam is depicted sort of mimic and call upon ways in which hermaphrodites are depicted also in that time of the world, that there's this parallel. And so Jesus then comes in to save all humanity, and restores us in some ways to that original humanity. And so this Jesus becomes the second Adam, and this takes on this gender role. And particularly, if you notice, Eve is coming from Adam's rib, and also Christ is pierced on the side in the church. And the soldiers come in to check to see if he's dead. So I didn't realize this gets so Bible-y so quickly. And if you go to the next slide, oftentimes the wound on the side of Jesus is depicted as a vagina. This is sort of Jesus's pussy, in other words, because it is from there that the church is birthed, sort of in sort of Catholic and potentially Orthodox doctrine. So just look up Jesus' vagina if you have more questions on that front. But that's something I wanted to just touch on in sort of medieval Europe. Jumping quickly to Asia, I've listed a bunch of terms, not all these. I'm definitely missing a bunch as well. My focus is a bit more on Southeast Asia, but there's some stuff also in China and in Korean. Also, these divisions are from the Cold War, and the Pacific Islands as well. And so I'm just going to focus on a couple of these terms, but I can speak a little bit more to the rest. There's a recent book that came out, Deities and Divas, Queer Ritual Specialists in Myanmar, Thailand, and Beyond. And I just excerpted a quote from the book, back of the book, basically. And the main phenomenon that these sort of anthropologists are realizing is that a lot of queer and queer men or trans women are finding more and more acceptance with their lifestyle, so to speak, by following the path of spirit mediumship, as opposed to other professions, and even as opposed to, let's say, being a quote unquote LGBTQ identified person or activist. And so these academics are trying to think about why it is there is this kind of convergence. The divas thing is mentioned partly because one of the theories is that a lot of the skills involved in become a medium, the makeup, the dress performance, you're channeling a deity, is similar to, Darren, you're talking about drag brunch, so channeling a diva in drag. And so there is a crossover between the skills required, so to speak. And when you see some of the performances, you can think like, okay, some of this does feel familiar if you've seen like a very certain kinds of drag performances. So this is a super interesting phenomenon that's currently happening. This other book, Gender Pluralism, Southeast Asia Since Early Modern Times, probably should have defined pluralism in the beginning, does a historical and contemporary perspective. It came out in the early 2000s, so contemporary, it's still a bit dated by now. But, and this is what I'll get into a little bit more. But pluralism here, I take from Michael Pauletz's work, which essentially means difference plus legitimacy. In other words, the question I'm asking is not have people with different genders and sexualities existed throughout time and history. Take that as like, yes, it's pretty obvious. The question is more how people have responded to them, how people have held them up, what roles they found for themselves in society. And that second question is sort of what I'm interested in. So we think of pluralism, it's not just about differences, but the differences that are seen as legitimate. And that's what I'm kind of interested in exploring. If we skip to the next couple slides, here are some photos of Nakadaos from Myanmar in particular, or I think Burma and another name for Myanmar. Just to get a sense of the outfits, the deities, you often are married to a divinity. That's how that relationship is understood. In this caption, and for them, dance is often involved, all that sort of stuff. Just to give some good photos, just as this photographer, Ken Kwok, has really good photos on his website. I'm going to pick a specific example from South Sulawesi, which is one of the more famous examples. And so we were pretty much the only or one of the few forms of documentation we have of the histories of these traditions. Some of them are very contemporary traditions, like I mentioned, the deities and divas thing, but some of them have a long history behind them. So South Sulawesi, here's this quote from Portuguese missionary Antonio de Paiva in 1544. Your lordship will know that the priests of these kings, so this Portuguese missionary writing back to his Catholic bishop, are generally called bisus. They grow no hair on their beards, dress in a womanly fashion, and grow their hair long and braided. They imitate women's speech because they adopt all of the female gestures and inclinations. They marry and are received according to the custom of the land with other common men. So who have this report essentially in the 16th century in this kind of scandalized letter about the priest equivalent of the Sulawesi, or particularly in this case, the Bugis people. And so you can see some photos in the next couple slides of what some of these pieces, contemporary pieces, look like. You can see you have you're holding the kris, which is a particular dagger that is associated with men. But then the makeup and some of the dress wear is associated with women. And the next slide will also kind of show what it looks like. You can see the offerings and the smoke that is coming up here. And within Bugis society, so this missionary describes it as men dressed as women, or men who speak like women. But there is actually a particular gender that they occupy. So there is a 5-gender system within Bugis society. So we have male men. If we can just skip to the next slide, because it lists them all. Female women, female men, and people who are neither male nor female, who are understood to be Bisu. My understanding there was a documentary recently that came out, maybe not that recently, but a documentary came out around Bisu, and it seems like I would say it's still mostly people who would be assigned male at birth. So can thoughts as to why that might be the case. But to me, what's actually the most interesting about this is that not all Bisu take up not how to put this, not everyone who takes up has that gender status, or neither male or female, take up this profession. To be a Bisu is a professional role. It's like saying I'm a priest, I'm a pastor, or I'm a imam. But it's a gender role, it's a professional role that's associated with a particular kind of gender status. And in the second half of this presentation, we can think about why that may be the case and what that means and what the implications are. And I remember learning about this stuff when I was, several years ago. And I remember being like, at one point in some ways, very shocked, because growing up in church, there isn't that particular association between trans and queerness and people who are seen to hold ritual and spiritual power and authority. And it's like, well, in some ways in the church, our experience tends to be the opposite. But we can talk more at the end. Maybe there are some parallels with the church, and why that might be the case, which is the fun part. But real quick on my sources here. In the next slide, you can take a screenshot if you would like to just have all these documents in one place. And I didn't touch on Hawaii or the Philippines or China or Vietnam, but we can talk that in the second section if you want. A quick snapshot from the Americas. This is a painting trying to depict a moment from Vasco Nunes del Balboa, a Spanish conquistador, who, according to this Italian historian, in 1513 sent his dogs to attack people whom he believed to be men dressed as women in eastern Panama. It also records that these were about 40 of them, people who served at a temple. And so he accused them of idolatry as well, and sodomy. And just at the next slide, 1585, you can see that part of the Catholic sort of doctrine and justification for the massacre and genocide of Indians is because of the vice of sodomy. So it says, let it be known that the reason why God has allowed that you, the Indians, should be so afflicted and vexed by other nations because of this vice sodomy that your ancestor had and many among you still have. So these historical sources, you have to kind of take them both ways. On one hand, they are prone to exaggerating the accounts that they see in order to justify a certain behavior towards them. On the other hand, the accounts are so widespread that it seems to be it is a real phenomenon. So historians go back and forth also on what exactly is happening in these temples. Were these relationships consensual? Were they sort of exploitative? It's a big question mark, but I bring those two things just to kind of give a snapshot into what might be happening in the moment of the colonial encounter between the indigenous peoples of Central and South America. In this case, that was Panama. That through the sort of Spanish lens. If we move up towards North America, I think most people are familiar with the term two-spirit. What's interesting, this is just a screenshot of a report that came together by Harlan Pruden and Seattle Edmo. You can go to the next slide. So if you're interested in this, you can just Google it yourself a little bit, and I'll have it in my works cited. But I just took a screenshot of various two-spirit names, because two-spirit is a generic term that came out in the 90s to refer to the terms that each tribe or nation would have for their own sort of people. But if you look at some of the names, I just try to take a sampling of names that imply different valences. So the next slide will show them. So you have from the Potawatomi tribe or nation, if you're a male assigned at birth, two-spirit person, the name given to you sort of means supernatural or extraordinary. Or you might have sort of, a more pejorative term, which, might mean coward. Or you might have something kind of in between, sort of neutral, like within the Navajo Nation. The name, the sort of literal translation of the name given to someone who might be seen as two-spirited is one who is in a constant state of change, one who changes being transformed. And so if you look, these are just a sampling, but the names can range from, pejorative to positive, and in general, although it's not always the case that two-spirited people are seen as also people who occupy the role of shaman or medicine people, but there tends to be a bit of an association with that. I think in some tribes or contexts, about 25% of people who are considered to be two-spirited would have occupied the role of shamans or medicine people, particularly in contexts where women tend to be the healers. So some sources you can look at, as I mentioned in the slide, you can take a screenshot of that. It's definitely by no means exhaustive, but just something for you to get started. The next slide will have the sources, so you can take a quick look there. All right, I'm almost done with my whirlwind tour. One last little bit, a little snapshot from the broad and very diverse continent of Africa. So this is from a book by, I'm going to just read out this quote, a town missionary working around the Congo in 1654, describing someone who this missionary calls, for lack of, because Swisha is clearly struggling to find the right terminology, grandmother wizard, and the which is kind of a cool name actually, and the term it's a Ganga Yanjimbanda, and this is how she describes this person. He dresses ordinarily as a woman and makes an honor of being called the grandmother, and then it goes into different sacrifices in person that this person does to call upon the spirits. These Ganga are in very high repute and win for themselves so much credit in the state that no general officer does not have one among them. To get a sense of the political role that these Ganga would have played. This is 1654, and if you scroll down, so this is an interview, different area, but technically in the nation state of Zimbabwe, but there's some overlap in traditions here. An interview of a male Nanga in the Gokwe district in Zimbabwe. And so Nanga, generally translated as spirit medium in this case, as person interviewing, and this is, I think, an interview happening in the 1990s. A lot of gays and lesbians who are afraid of being victimized are now pretending to be traditional healers with the opposite sex of a spirit medium. Some families have come to me so I would try to convince them that their offspring has got a spirit medium. I've also helped a few young gays and lesbians in that respect so that their families will not keep on pushing them to get married. So if you recall in the beginning, I started with this book talking about deities and divas in mainland Southeast Asia and how a lot of queer people are going into that profession, perhaps to find some social legitimacy. This person is essentially indicating a similar phenomenon happening and among young queer folks, in this case, Zimbabwe. So I've tried to give you examples from history, from contemporary times. These are some of my sources that you can look at. There's a lot more. I can go through some tables to kind of walk you through some different examples happening across the continent of Africa, but I wanted to just pause and get your responses so far. We don't have to do a screen share for this part. We can just close it. But yes, do people have any feelings that come up? Any questions? The next section of this, I want us to think about what are the larger, higher level questions, implications and ideas that might be coming out of this for us beyond just like fun facts to know a trivia. tends to be sometimes the takeaway of audiences after these things. And so I think there's this quote by Lee Edelman. So I will cite this sort of white American guy. But I think actually in some ways it is relevant to what I'm talking about. And it's a quote that I think both is very resonant, but also in some ways what I'm presenting is a bit of the antithesis of this quote. So it's a useful quote in that regard. Queerness is not identity, it is what falls outside of identity. It is the refusal of identity. It is the very thing that disrupts enclosed communities' identities, opening them up to include whoever has been excluded. And I think in some ways a lot of this feels resonant with Edelman's quote because what we're talking about, the ways in which queerness and transness in particular has been presented in these examples, is that they are very much intimately associated with particular roles, particular professions, particular verbs, in other words, that it is not something that queerness, transness is not just a sort of static individual attribute that one has as one walks around the world, but it tends to be associated with a particular set of verbs. And so I wanted to think in general about how we think about verbs versus nouns or adjectives. And, if you think about if we say someone is a runner versus someone who says, I run, or someone who paints versus someone who says, I'm a painter. And then have those implications, think about also with what it means to be queer versus to queer. And when we switch the grammatical mode, we think of queerness and transness and what options that opens up for us versus does not open up for us. And to be even more specific, what it means to put on makeup versus to, quote, be a woman. What it means to have sex with someone same gender or anatomy differently, but versus to be gay. And so part I think I want to take away from all of this is if we think about queerness and transness as verbs, I think it kind of opens up potentially more options and more freedom and flexibility than sort of this perhaps more confining boxes of identity give us. And the other thing I want to help us, the other implication I think that comes from all of this is I'm actually going to quote something from this academic writing about lesbian same-sex love in China, which I have not talked about either China or lesbian stuff, but I think the ideas in here are pretty relevant. So this academic, her name is Professor Sang, she was looking at the translation of the word homosexual into the Chinese language. And I'm not a fluent speaker of Mandarin by any means, but she noticed that the translation of homosexual, which is coming from these European, mostly German sexology scientific articles in the 1900s, that's translated as Hong Xing Lian. And Hong, if you look at the breakdown of each word, means same, Xing is nature, truth, also can mean gender, sexuality, and Lian is really related to Lian I, falling in love, romantic love. And so I mean, it seems like a pretty similar, close translation, but there actually are pretty key differences. And this is the difference she points out. The focus here, as you know, this is on same love. I mean, the ways people might say same gender loving among certain communities in the United States, particularly I think more in Black communities. I think that is probably a closer relevance to how this word is translated as opposed to gay, as opposed to homosexual. And so the implication of this is what Dr. Sang says is that the Republican, in this case, Republican means the Republican era in the early 1900s in China, doesn't mean the party. The Republican Chinese discourse on same-sex love did not make the homosexual an identity akin to a racial minority, the predominant figure standing for same-sex attraction. In contrast, many Chinese intellectuals inclined towards an understanding of same-sex love as relational and situational. The traditional Chinese understanding of the self is seldom perceived as an autonomous, independent identity. It is more often taken to be the site where a set of relations converge. The self takes shape in reference to others and within communities. Therefore, same-sex desire may not be said to properly belong to a subject. When I read this quote, I think a sort of light bulb came off in my head. It's a very concrete example of what this person is talking about. So to put it in sort of very visual terms, if we think of the subject of the self in sort of modern contemporary Western terms, is a self that is buffered. So think of it as a closed circle, so to speak. And I'm the circle, and I'm me, and this is how I identify, and I move around the world like that. But if you take the self as something more porous, as a place where relationships converge, and that is in flux depending on the context and communities you walk into, then that also changes how you understand same-sex attraction. It goes from maybe a static attribute to more about love and more about the relationship and situations you're in. And a good example of this is that, and a very concrete example of this is that within my trans family, and I'm here with my grandmother downstairs, so I'm thinking about this a lot. We, it's not only is it rude to call someone, particularly someone elderly, by their name. It's actually, I think I once asked my dad what my grandma's name was, and he said, "Are you trying to call her by it? That's really rude." And wouldn't even tell me, and then I had to press him a bit more. Then he was like, "Okay, this is her name." Because you're really, I'm supposed to refer her by her relationship to me, which is as grandmother in this case. And there are very particular names for paternal grandmother, and the whole kinship system is interesting. But what matters is the relationship we have with each other, as opposed to this is your name, this is my name, that we carry around ourselves, no matter what room we walk into. So that's a pretty concrete example. But to return to Southeast Asia and to think about religion specifically, I'm curious if you all have any thoughts about what this is not time for Q&A. All right, so I'll just give my thoughts, and you can give your thoughts at the end. What might the convergence of gender pluralism and ritual or religious specialists mean? What does it mean? Why is it that all these mediums or priests, so to speak, to use European translation, and have you tend to be queer and trans? Why? What's up? And I think this is somewhat the $1 million question, and it depends on the context and all that kind of stuff. But regardless of why, I think the convergence itself offers is sort of, I would say, different ways of thinking about what it means to be trans and to be queer. And so the next slide, I'll talk about it. Essentially, I feel like in my take on things, that it offers us mediation as opposed to opposition as a way of thinking about particularly transness, responsibility instead of disruption, and tradition instead of transgression. And so when I think of mediation, I'm thinking particular mediation between not the spirit world, the human world. A medium is doing that very concretely, often negotiating between deities and humans. And also, and to be clear, a lot is happening in the context of trans that is in flux, not just gender, but identities are in flux. Sometimes spirits of nature are answering and being talking back. So everything is sort of in motion. Gender is just one of those variables. Responsibility as opposed to disruption. To have these roles, it depends, but often involves a high level of communal responsibility. If you're not doing the ritual correctly, you could bring about, disastrous consequences on behalf of the community. People are looking to you to perform the right rituals for births, for marriages, for deaths, for, new occasions. It's the way you might call on a pastor to do certain things. And so there's a huge level of responsibility, as opposed to, I think, the connotations of disruption, which tends to be, I think, what LGBTQ means a little bit more in contemporary West. And then thirdly, oftentimes these folks are stewards of tradition. And so how do we think about that as opposed to transgression, which tends to be how queer folks are seen as transgressing tradition. And so I wanted to flip that balance and think about what if queer folks are really upholding a certain kind of tradition. So I mentioned all this, you could think about as a way to not to say that the words on the left are what we should aim for as a way to decolonize LGBT, and the words on the right are what we should move away from. I think both are valid. It just sort of depends what histories and traditions you come from. And I mentioned them just in some ways to decenter the sort of contemporary Western paradigm as the main paradigm by which we think about, as the only paradigm by which we think about queerness. It's not the only paradigm, it's not the only natural paradigm. And I think it makes a lot of sense in many ways that to be queer and trans is associated with disruption, with transgression, with opposition, given the history of queer and trans folks, and particularly like 19th, 20th century in America and Europe. I identify with that as well because of my experiences of ways in which being queer has forced me to kind of go against the grain in the church and in social context. So I would claim the Western tradition as also part of mine. At the same time, I've always found it a little lacking, and I couldn't figure out what was lacking until I started doing this research. And I was like, oh yes, there is a huge set of values in the way I've been raised to care about communal responsibility, to care about tradition, to care about harmony and balance and mediation that feels in opposition to sort of I would say my identities as a queer and trans person. And so I think this research helped me think about what if there are actual ways in which this can come together and you can understand what it means to hold multiple genders as a source of power that can be used for the community and not just as a stigmatized identity. So, and it's not to say that obviously the folks I mentioned in this presentation aren't also stigmatized. You can be both. You can be revered and also seen as a little weird in the way that putting someone on a sacred pedestal can be. So it's not to say they're wholly accepted, especially outside the ritual context. They might still face a lot of social stigma. But I think the point is that the context gives them permission to be otherwise. And we can talk about why that might be the case. Maybe it's the specialness of performance that when you are performing a ritual, people are like, okay, yeah, a god of a different gender has entered them. That's where they're acting as a woman, in the way we might think about performance in theater or in drag, stuff like that. But I think what's powerful is that then you're then going to that person asking for their blessing, asking for them to, bless your family, or to use, a Christian term, stuff like that. We're not just like, that was a great performance, here's $1. And so I think that changes the nature of that interaction. So these are some of my thoughts. That's really all I have to say.